The question that I was proposing was how I could describe the structure of my work. And there are many different ways, but I wanted to make a series of prefaces to that may unfortunately take up our time or not. But I just sort of, someone said to Jean-Paul Sartre, why don't you have more sex in your books? And he said, when everybody else does it, when everybody else puts their cards on the table, I'll put mine. But I'm willing to, in that sense, put my cards on the table. I remember Meyer Shapiro said, once in your lifetime, at least, every intellectual owes it to discuss their method. And is this working acoustically?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. A little bit of a method. But I wanted to start, since I am a quote practitioner, with a poem I didn't read. I have a few poems that I think also are, quote, about this problem. And one is really called To My Critics. You should always memorize your poems. My mother said, memorize many poems, it'll be useful to you in prison. She was a Trotskyite, and she believed that I would be, at some point in prison, it would be very useful. It's been useful in other places, like crowded cars. I would say memorize many poems because you're always in prison. I'm always dazzled by poets who say it doesn't matter whether this is memorable or not. One of the kinds of toughnesses that I have within me is that I do expect painters to make memorable shapes, to cut out memorable shapes, as we say of Picasso, and I do expect poets to have some relationship to memory. It seems to me that some of the greatest poetry is not difficult to memorize, it's actually impossible to forget. So that this indelibility is a characteristic of the lyric. When you hear a good song by Schubert or by Paul McCartney, you begin to realize that they are machines of repetition. I had someone who said, you can't read a poem for the first time ever, or you can't listen to music for the first time ever. It's true that, and I'll discuss this, so the part of me that's a scholar of architecture and art, or at least a student amateur of those fields and others, knows that what's built into certain works of art is sufficient repetition so that you are being lulled or hypnotized into memorizing what has been said or remembering. This is sometimes wrong because, let's say, when poetry gets to be such a multeity, when it gets to be such a collage, you may remember parts of a poem, but not all. I once met a friend of Frank O'Hara's who said to me, and you really think Frank is a great poet, like a Donne? Can you remember anything? And I said, well, it's hard to forget a fleece of pure intention riding like a pinto in a bark of slaves, who soon will turn upon their captors, lower anchor, found a city riding there of sweetness and poverty paralleled among the cities without time. And one alone will speak of being born in pain, and he will be the wings of an extraordinary liberty. It's very hard to forget that. He will be the wings of an extraordinary liberty. You may not necessarily fall in love with the poem so well that you'll hear these things, but it seems to me that one of the things that Jakobson was right about, and we associate him with the word structure, is that poetry, simplifying, so you don't have to read 42 volumes of Jakobson, whom I regard as a great critic, and who loved art and poetry. He was kind of secretary to Malevich. He was very close to the Zaum poets like Klebnikov, who were very interested in sound and transreferentiality, they said. And Jakobson basically said, of all the languages I know, it's not as if you'll always find rhyme, it's not as if you'll always find this characteristic. One characteristic that he felt was always there in communicative schemas, and certainly in poetry, was repetition itself. So, and also this complicated sense that the first line is a partner also of the last line. It's a partner of the next line, but it's a partner of everything. This becomes very interesting in painting. For example, we always joke that when Robert Rauschenberg found a mistake, he kept it. Fine. Great lithograph break. The stone broke, he accepted it. Jasper, we often say, if there's one infinitesimal problem, he rethinks the entire painting. One of the things that my teacher loved to do was to show corrections to a work and to see whether you could see how that would have failed. Wittgenstein says of such an approach, there are too many relationships to know that that's what you have done. It is interesting to see revisions. And here's something that I think is basic to what I wanted to say about critics, is that I'm dogmatically anti-dogmatic. It's something that Wayne Booth used to talk about, the limits of pluralism. my teacher, Meyer Shapiro, also said to me many things that I'll quote. One of them was, what pluralism cannot contain, David, is the advantage of purity. You can't be a good Hasid and also be very promiscuous. There are some clashing values in poetry. You may not be able to resolve them. There's a tragedy of pluralism. This is to our critics. I felt that a lot of critics, though, however, wanted to resolve things for themselves. I call them good policemen in sort of good neighborhoods, but they were beating you up. I'll list some of those critics because I can be precise about this, since they're very often not. But this is a poem that I got in a dream. It's called To Our Critics. I dreamt the Dean of Architecture taught me how to pitch with a specific curve. I claimed I knew how to pitch that ball, the soft ball, the hard, but he had a specific curve in mind. I forgot my poetry, all of it, in notebooks like the sketch of a glove, like lost leather gloves without irony to this day. You built a chair for everything. I dreamt I had forgotten proper names and proper nouns, forgotten parts of bodies like a word on an obscene blackboard in another dream. I dreamt the critics who deposed the dream had died. Of a brutal phantasmagoria in proscription. They had proscribed themselves. Here is something that's influenced me. There was a time when I didn't like the word postmodern because it was being used by my student Hal Foster in a proscriptive way. This is good, this is bad. Rosalind Krauss, who had been a student of Greenberg and who had done this a great deal, Greenberg suggesting that there was this kind of painting that was good, he would go over to your studio and say, this is good, do 20 more of those. This is bad, it's over. Greenberg finally thought only a certain kind of painting was good. Interestingly enough, Rosalind has inverted this, and she simply thinks that painting is dead. I called her up rather early one day, and I said, do you really believe that painting has died? Like an old moose that has been thrown apart, or like the hole in the heart of New York. She said, I only report on the large sociological facts, David. I said, but isn't there, of course, one should be able to quote against oneself, but I remember feeling good in the morning when I said, what about the large sociological fact of liberty? You can see that I'm a student of these humanists like Arendt and others, Benjamin, who still felt that there was a darkened possibility of gestures. So she said, I believe it's been replaced by video. So you, in the video machine, should realize that certainly it's hard to get a modest sense of the media. We know how dictators have loved the media. I have a friend, Al Maisels, who's a very good documentarist. Godard says the best eye in America. And he says to me, what I am doing, David, is the truth. For example, the truth, not a fiction. I am the first realist in American cinema. And then he always quotes Tolstoy, who said, when he saw cameras for the first time, he had lived that long, I hope you do, see the anti-camera, and he said, Tolstoy said, or is said to have said, now we'll not have to write novels anymore. Whether it's apocryphal or not, it gives that sense that for Albert, unless you're doing a certain kind of documentary, you are not capturing the truth. Godard said to him, let's collaborate. And he said, well, I only like the truth. Rather simple, wonderful person who had a PhD in psychology and sort of stole a camera. And Godard said, oh, it'll be like that. I will set up a movie where you won't know what's happening, and you'll simply have to deal with it. Al was willing to do that. It reminds you of how much my generation is an admirer of Godard, that I always remember things he said. So if you want to look for a great critic today, you might want to read Godard on Godard or anything he ever writes. Rather surly and interesting. One thing he's famous for saying that you might all know is, my works have a beginning, middle, and end, but not in that order. And it seems to me that he's a kind of pluralist critic himself, but if you read him, you'll see that he did function, as Jeremy Gilbert-Rolfe once said, all criticism could function by redeeming the marginal, by underlining those who are not known. It's easy for you to do the 17,000th book on, relatively easy to do it on The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It's relatively easy for me to write perhaps about John Constable, and I do. But Jeremy is right, I think, that we're talking about the job of criticism. Part of the job of criticism, I think, is a sort of political resistance. I say this on the day of a demonstration. It's a demonstration of loyalty or solidarity with those artists who no longer, who do not have that support. That's very different than negative criticism. So I was thinking today of who I honor among my teachers in this pluralism. And I brought you some slides of Fairfield Porter, but I'll talk about a few others and what I've learned from them. First of all, because I was born in a family of music, a lot of my work comes out of ideas that occurred to me when I was practicing 8 hours a day. And so I do believe in the practice of criticism and the practice of poetry. That is, someone said he was writing a poem a day. I said, no, I think the important thing is to write all day. There are these jokes about labor, and it does seem to me that I come from a generation that wanted to jettison certain aspects of the learned style in, let's say, Eliot, where every line can make you go to an entire civilization. I heard in a bookstore once, a woman say, I studied Greek just so I could understand the epigraphia in the wasteland. And the person said, can you? She said, yeah, it turns out to be fairly simple. And then I turned to her, she didn't know me, a stranger, as one does, and I said, but isn't it sweet that one poem led you to an entire culture, to an entire language? So I think people have asked me, what do I need to know with your poetry? And it is useful to say everything. And I think that this is, though, not a whimsy, since it's an impossibility, but it reminds you that critics have a task that's interesting. Meyer Shapiro once said to Blackmer, who said, oh, you New York intellectuals, you know a little bit too much. And he said, Robert, when you use your mind, you do not use it up. One of the powerful things about Meyer Shapiro was his perspectivism. He had learned from Riegel, and just putting my cards on the table, it's true that I can be very tough on other people, but I don't believe philosophically that there's necessarily in any interesting way the bad or the good. Jeremy Gilbert-Rolfe is opposite to this. He will sometimes say, I'll say, how did you like the show? He'll say, some was better than others. It was art. Meaning that he really does associate criticism and a critique that's very often negative. He likes to go to any show of Bill de Kooning and say, pathos, David, pathos, pathos, pathos. But always in the sense that this expressionism is a liability. Jeremy, when I sometimes practice another art like painting or music, will say to me, written any poetry today, David? Meaning he doesn't believe, he says, that art is a gratuitous thing that's played out along the lines of a playful grid. I have another friend, Lucio Pozzi, who comes out of the 60s, and you might say much more permissive. He's collaborated with Guattari, and his sense is always, that's wonderful, to do other things and other things. He does videos and paintings and this and this. And Meyer Shapiro sometimes was seeming for some people to be a musician of all instruments. You don't often see a good cellist be a great clarinetist. What's amazing about Meyer's criticism is that he tried to adjust all perspectives in order to save certain things. When the Romanesque period, well, I'll even give you we were talking about Freud last night and attacks on Freud. Meyer Shapiro was one of the most vigorous opponents of certain errors in Freud. And he's written a very famous study of Leonardo, which upset the whole psychoanalytic community because he found mistranslations, a lack of art history, a lack of a lot of different cognitive particulars that would have led Freud's book to be unassailable. Then, instead of giving aid and to the anti-psychoanalytic aspects of our culture, he then went on to write very beautiful psychological studies of Cézanne, finding in his apples, Barney Newman said, those aren't apples, those are cannonballs. He found in the apples a gift that was filled with eros, and it's a very great essay. He had not renounced all of Freud. He said to me, there are creative errors, but he also was willing to see what was fruitful. That's, I think, the pragmatic in him. There's one very good example of criticism in my time, and many, but one of them is the Jacques Derrida, whom I got close to, whom I always teased that he was a Jewish poet, and who boxed himself into a corner really till the very late stages. If you read the books of the last 8 years, he discusses forgiving the unforgivable in the context of South Africa, an amazing formulation. Cities of refuge, human rights. In many ways, I think he did acknowledge that he had pushed himself so far from realia. I also felt that too. For a very long time, I thought, as Jacobson the formalist did, that poetry was largely about itself, a self-focusing, self-telescoping palpability. It wasn't a mirror. It wasn't a window. It was a black mirror, an often shattered black mirror. Jakobson, I felt, was one of the great critics. He loved Meyer Shapiro. So I'm mentioning this. In this century, Jacques Derrida, Heidegger, and Meyer Shapiro, and I, in a sense, were locked in a quarrel. Van Gogh painted shoes. Yes, possibly around 1885 in Paris. And I should have a slide of it. But you can imagine Van Gogh's shoes if you've ever seen them. There are only a few. One's in Boston. Heidegger wrote an essay on the truth in art and said, among other things, and it's always very dangerous to stand on one leg and summarize Heidegger, but I will say that Heidegger felt it was a woman's shoe and it was striding through the great fields of being and had soil attached to it that also reminded one of the peasant attitude that had never been lapsed by Van Gogh. Meyer Shapiro, after the war, wrote him a letter saying, "Dear Mr. Heidegger, what are you referring to? Which shoes? Since there are no peasant woman's shoes among these particular ones, and the one that you particularly sent out is either one of the battered self-portraits that Van Gogh was doing, but it certainly wasn't a disclosure of being. It was actually very specific, and Meyer said at that time he had become a man of the city, not a man of the peasantry." Heidegger never responded, though he seems to have made a minor change in his work in the essay. Jacques Derrida, at a certain moment, wrote, I think, one of his largest and perhaps most foolish books called The Truth in Painting. He isn't very good on the subject of art. He hasn't really married it in a complete way. He doesn't look at art very often. But he said that Meyer Shapiro and Heidegger were both appropriating the truth. They were both appropriators. They were projectors. They were positivists in their own way. Of course, he really knew his Heidegger, so he's actually very careful to say some very nice things about Heidegger. But he finally says, Heidegger, the Aryan, sees peasant boots. Shapiro, a New York Jewish guy, sees, I'm being pretty close, sees city shoes. And then Derrida goes on to say, for about another 100 pages, what is a shoe? And what is a pair? How do you know that it is a pair? And he goes on to say some wonderful things also about the laces, which Meyer Shapiro did include in certain ways. But anyway, he goes on to say that essentially for him, there can be no perfected appropriation of a work in this positivist sense, that this is the limit of criticism. I then wrote, I have to say that I wrote a defense of Meyer because I felt, if you go to a cardiologist, it's very useful to have a man who's tactful towards your heart. Your heart may not be the generic other heart. I felt that whatever Jacques was saying, he had said about almost every painter of the 20th century. He was not changing in any sense his tone. And so if you think of Derrida, you very often think that it's almost a monolithic neo-Nietzscheanism. He had painted himself into a certain corner. They were all talking about that which was illisible. As when my son once said, it reminded me of Jacques, does Bambi's mother really die, Dad? And I said, well, you can't be sure. You're not really seeing her buried in that. So there are a lot of ways in which I tried to protect what I felt was a very patient thing, so that you can say that one of the things that I appreciate is that clock stopped still. Mm-hmm. Yes. It takes a little while to appreciate what a clocked stop might mean. For example, when de Chirico paints a stopped clock, you know that it's the melancholy of an afternoon that's infinite, and it signifies in many, many ways something. When Rimbaud talks about a clock, which I mentioned before, it's very often a velleity of a paradise in which things are not what they seem to be. When, let's think of other clocks, when Dali does his famous melting clocks, you know that it's a sort of cadaverish technical feat indicating fluidity of time, etc. So, at any rate, I feel that Jacques was a person who, no matter what he was reading, came up with the same thing. Kenneth Koch said, there are these critics and poets who throw their line into the ocean, but they've secretly painted the fish on the fish hook. Then they bring it up and say, look what I found. Meyer Shapiro, as a great critic, influenced me. I met him 40 years ago with my wife. It was the first day I met my wife. And afterwards, I thought we both had two different opinions. I said it was a golden cadenza, amazing, this drifting praise that makes him look so saintly. Elaine de Kooning says people went to see just even the spittle of his mouth. He was regarded as heroic because he was the first person to start modern art at Columbia and teach it. He had a great deal of faith in Pollock when Pollock was doing things. And he also brought, which may not be astounding to you, he brought painters to talk the schmears to talk in the art history. It was a revelation. It had never been done before. He tended to say to people, for example, Motherwell said two things that I think are good for a critic to know. He said, could you give me a reading list on Marx? And Meyer said, Marxism is not a reading list. It is a way of life. He didn't want him to take that kind of shortcutter. Here's the bibliography. Now you've had the work done for you. Motherwell also complained that now that the Surrealists were in town, he'd like to learn more about them and art. He had been a philosophy student. And Meyer said, visit the studios. And that was to say that among the critics of his day, Meyer admired even interviews because he felt that artists did know something about their work. It was not a cow drinking milk or evaluating milk. He felt that artists and their statements should be paid attention to. It doesn't mean that he always felt they were right. When Gauguin said of those shoes came about when Vincent took a long walk from Brussels, perhaps. And he found also the shoes in a shop. This is a little contradictory. He found battered shoes in a shop and took them. Gauguin is not always a reliable witness. But I think it's very important that the artist's criticism was finally edited by Robert Motherwell. I think one of the great acts of his life, not his painting, but the great anthologies of Apollinaire on art. I translated Sonia Delaunay on art, etc. So when I'm teaching Cézanne, what often comes through my mind is brisé comme le compotier de Cézanne, broken like the fruit dish of Cézanne, which the Delaunay's repeat until you feel the shattering. William de Kooning was one of my gods, and I met my wife also arguing about him. She thought he was sloppy, I thought he was God. She was indicating that she preferred a gallery show that week of Pousette d'Art. I said, who is this girl who likes Pousette d'Art? I hardly knew Pousette d'Art, but I was already thinking no one could be better, of course. There's now a show of Pousette d'Art in the Whitney, and of course he's not as good as, to me, as good as de Kooning, but why is the comparison needed? Jeremy Gilbert-Rolfe always says to me, Shakespeare was better than you, David. But that becomes uninteresting at a certain moment. It's as if you said that John Ashbery wasn't as good as Wallace Stevens. There's a kind of golden age, a golden past, a cyclical Viconian way of discussing art. I urge you not to fall into a sort of vulgar Darwinism in which a man's late work is always the best, in which a culture's latest work is the best. A person who was going to visit Meyer one day said to me, what do you think he'll say on progress in art? I said, don't ask him. He doesn't believe in it. Meyer once said to me, there is no progress in art. And as Jeremy used to say, do you think you're smarter than Giotto? Do you think you know more about painting than Leonardo? It's very unlikely. For local problems, you might say that Leonardo is better than most of the people in this class at many things. Recently, an anatomist said that it was hard to believe that Leonardo was so good at perspective that many of his drawings of the body were unrivaled in modern technological X-rays till about 20 years ago in the MRI. So I just want to say this so that you don't fall off your horse too much and convert to another name. Elaine de Kooning said that this is what happened to them. They were figurative artists, and at a certain moment they fell off their horses and changed their names from Saul to Paul. What's interesting is that I've watched the other part of that conversion. There were many figurative artists who were at war with abstract artists who were at war with, in a kind of terrifying love of battle. There was this battle between the abstract expressionists and finally all abstract artists. And sometimes it was a battle within. For example, Mondrian, I'm going to show you one flower, kept secret that he was painting flowers. He did say, maybe this is an act of prostitution. But we know that he did it more than 100 times. You wonder how many times was Mondrian willing to prostitute himself. Also, he kept these, and just after I wrote a book about them, everyone putting me down for this secret garden of Mondrian, I asked the photographer who had visited him what he was like. He said, well, first, very generous. He gave me 2 paintings. One wasn't enough. And then I said, any word about the flowers? He said, yes. He took out a flower painting or drawing, he wasn't sure, and said, isn't this wonderful? So there are a variety of ways in which we feel that he could have made money, in a variety of ways we don't think for the 10 cents or the gift that he was giving of flowers, that it was that. Why was Mondrian so secret, finally, about these flowers? He wasn't secret about them being painted in 1906. But he didn't like the idea that he returned to them in 1926. He was supposedly a man who believed in evolution. One of his great pictures is a person progressively abstracted And he did this with his trees, which are famously progressively abstracted. Jasper Johns, by the way, says that his favorite show of all time was the early work of Mondrian. Why did Mondrian feel this? Sometimes I will apply a Freudian thing. He had flunked, by the way, the male nude. And many of us feel that he found the nude in these flowers, in the naked structure of flowers. He found an erotic equivalence, as perhaps Cézanne did in his apples. I do think it's interesting that MoMA, that has a flower and has never put it out, that the Guggenheim that has a flower leaves it inside its warehouse, this little chrysanthemum. And so with Mondrian, I think you're getting a person who betrays himself with theory. That's the man who prescribes himself. There have been critics in that sense who have prescribed so much activity that they finally prescribe themselves. Interestingly, Jeremy, by the way, I just take these two critics. You might add Gilberto Perez is a great critic of film. These two critics, two friends, Lucio Pozzi and Jeremy Gilbert Rolfe, are so different than each other. But Jeremy, who says you must be devoted to one art, is very well known as the art critic who started October magazine with Rosalind Krauss. He's also known for writing 3 other books, one dedicated to me, and I helped him get published. But let me say, he's really one of the outstanding critics of our day, and is filled with a kind of whiplash. Someone has called him the bitter emigre in tone. But if you want to learn a kind of critique of pluralism, he once said to me, amazing and debilitating pluralism. He also said, we talk about pluralism in America, but do we have it? No, we have this homogenized 100 merchants who are creating the art of our time. Jeremy is a very useful person that way, but it's interesting that he's written a novel, essays about novelists, that he himself has a very plural mode. He thinks that he comes out of Barnett Newman, but actually his work comes out of many things. So I'm just going to mention an act of criticism that I also love. Bill de Kooning was very melancholy, almost to suicidal feelings, they say, in the 30s. I've checked this out with him. He was painting, perhaps in the late 40s, he was painting Woman Number 1 as we know it. But at the time, he didn't know it. And as a critic, he was a little too lacerating. As a good critic of himself, he said, it's wrong. And like Giacometti, he destroyed it every day. Some of these pictures remain photographed by his friend Rudy Burkhardt. People were very worried because he was a skillful craftsman, as you know, and he usually finished paintings in a few months at the least. But here he was going crazy in revision, and he didn't know what he could do, and he had put it, people thought, aside and was stopping painting. That's how tough hatred can be. And let's remember William James, who says, Jack and Jill are on the hill, we think they're idiots. They seem to find a lot in each other. And he says, in a certain blindness on human beings, who knows more about themselves, Jack and Jill or us? We're under the delusion, like Bill de Kooning, that we know that they're idiots, that this painting cannot be. Someone said, invite Meyer Shapiro over. He stayed in a very famous moment for about 8 hours. I urge you to write this play. We don't know what they said. At the end of it, de Kooning signed it, put it aside, and did 18 other paintings in a very quick thing. And the painting is regarded as Woman Number 1 in the Museum of Modern Art. One of my students said, it's so ugly. And I said, isn't that wonderful? You'll never see a more ugly painting. She said, I'll never see a more ugly painting. I said, yes. You will never see a more ugly painting till the day you die. People sometimes oppose beauty and ugliness, but of course, that's too simple a rejoinder. I used to say that poetry was the opposite of stupidity. So I asked Bill de Kooning, is it true that Meyer came over and cheered you up about Woman Number 1? He said, yes, tell that guy to come again. He's rather sick at the time. He says that what you do is what you should be doing, not like those other people who say, don't do what you're doing. Tell him to come again. Tell him to come again. And I called up Meyer Shapiro and said, Bill de Kooning would really like you to visit him. He said, well, he has been saying that for about 30 years. It's been a little difficult for me to... So they didn't meet again. But I learned a lot from that kind of what we could call positive criticism. Hegel talks about the night in which all cows are black. It could seem to be too much of a positivity. But I want to say that Cuthbert once talked about a critic who looks at a work of art, I'll call this Woman Number 2, and who looks at a work of art, and a blank piece of paper changes in context. It's one thing in India. Is it a tantric glimpse of Buddha? It's one thing during minimalism, a mere fact. It's one thing. Even a blank piece of paper can appear in many different ways. You may not see the woman in it because she's drowned in snow. But let me just say that there are negative critics who I think have ruined things for us. For example, the critics who say, let's think of things, that painting has disappeared are truly destructive in their dogmas. Meyer talked about creative errors, but I think those who consistently said that they were against paint, against this and against that. Now, everyone has the right to revise and to find weaknesses, and we were talking about that. There are many poems that I've written that are, you could say, are counterexamples. I even have a poem called The Counterexample. But I'm not sure that I appreciate negative criticism as much as I do this friend of mine, Fairfield Porter, another critic. Do you have the slides? Let's turn off the light. Fairfield Porter was born around 1907, 1908 in Chicago. Fairfield was born in 1907, 1908 in Chicago. And his father was an architect. He came from a fairly interesting family, cousins of T.S. Eliot. His own wife is a great religious poet, Anne Porter. I've edited her works. I tricked her into giving me her poems. Someone said, she's not even a player, said a certain poet. And I thought, how disgusting to think of that. This woman has been writing in her 94th year. I've published another book of her. And I once said to Fairfield, would you become a Catholic? No. Would you become a religious in any way like your wife? He said, no. I might become a Catholic because they let everybody in. He said, but I would like every sermon to end with these words. And I agree with him. I would like every sermon to end with these words. Pay attention. Pay attention to ultimate reality. He said, of course, John Ashbery laughed at me the other day and said, what does ultimate mean, Fairfield? And I said, well, of course, but John has praised the religion of the outsides of things in Ponge, Pasternak, and Elion. And when he pays attention just to the outsides of things and the outsides of words, as it were, he creates a kind of sacred example. And Fairfield, looking at the ocean, said, that's it. It's not behind everything. It is everything. Now, a lot of people feel that my pluralism is a permission. There's something right about permission. Permission is not a bad word to remember when you talk about the anxiety of influence. Not only is there an anxiety of influence, but there's also a joy of influence and erotics of influence. This pleasure of influence is what the Greeks called paideia, or excellence. It's one of the ways that we know in the 18th century, it's often been said that we had people who didn't join the ancients and the moderns in a debate. The very great minds, they didn't waffle, but they understood that it was a truncated Procrustean theoretical problem and that there had to be a way out. Fairfield was told by Clement Greenberg one day, you can't paint figuratively in this generation. This is historicist criticism, which would be among my critiques of criticism. This historicist mode, which came in this case out of the Communist Party, this is what is needed now. It is no accident that this is what's happening now. And Clement Greenberg said, you must paint, but not figuratively. I think this is actually rather smaller than the work itself, but I like it. It's very intense. And I didn't bring an X-ray gun to radiate you. Talking about Fairfield Porter, he did make his own criticism, and he often was extremely open to many things. He was willing to say what he didn't particularly admire, but he never hypothesized it and said, I don't admire this, and neither should anyone. What I'm saying now in some Kantian way is a categorical imperative for everyone. Not only is painting dead, but you must understand it as dead. Particularly interesting when one of the people who says this is colorblind. But that, I think, is useful to know about the limits of someone towards art and how long it takes. My editor recently said to me, I don't understand your poetry, David. I guess it takes time. Fairfield looked at this and said to me, this is the kind of painting they hate me to paint. Why? Said I. They can't sell it. Why? It's actually now the cover of a beautiful book on Fairfield Porter. He said, you see that machinery? He said, yeah. He said, they can't publish it. They can't deal with it. And they certainly can't sell it. People don't want to see that. A lot of the romantics in the 19th century would expunge the factory and keep the Native American in. I once wanted to be painted by Cornelia Foss. I said, but let's wait till my stomach is less. She said, I can take it out in a second. Here's the problem. They didn't like this bit of reality. I said, so why did you paint it, Fairfield? He said, because it was there. He believed that art was a mounting of particulars. He disagreed with Bucky, who thought truth was beauty. He loved to see a Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome be smashed in the wind. One day he said, I just had this great pleasure of watching a Bucky geodesic dome in Maine blown by the capriciousness, the particularity, and the sensuousness of a real world that he felt was being crucified by Bucky's sense that truth alone in science would save you. I'm not, by the way, anti-scientific, but I'm against a certain kind of scientism. But in this case, it's very interesting that the empirical side of Fairfield wins out. There'll be many other things I want you to know, but I think it's particularly sad that even in the realm of this purity and impurity, it met up with this difficulty. And I think that Wolf Kahn, who's been guilty, some people say, of the pornography of landscape, who has painted 1,000 barns recently and 1,000, very great pastelist in the 50s. Cezanne died in a rainstorm. He died outside and inside, as it were. And so Fairfield Porter believed that Clement Greenberg was wrong when he said, you must be an abstract painter. You will never be able to create major work. And Fairfield said to himself and told me, I then decided never to paint an abstract work again. I said, but your work has a lot of Kikuchi in it. He said, I see that. Others don't. But Kikuchi says, I see it. He was consistently trying to do two things which critics found very difficult. My friend Jim Dunn said to me, he's just, you poets, he's just a bad, normal painter, David. He's just a bad, normal painter. Years later, of course, Jim Dunn changed his own style to something that was very much influenced by rendering and by Fairfield Porter. Go on. Next slide. Really important. Keep it in touch with the idea of 45 minutes. When would that end?
Do we have questions later, or do you want
yes,
questions as you talk?
Let's do it later. We'll just bluntly walk that way because I'll be defensive. Maybe not. This is his father's house in Maine where I visited. And again, it may seem to many of us busy or merely figurative, or as you look more closely, you see that as he grew, he began to be extremely interested in light, the effect of light. He said to me, David, I'm interested in rendering the sun. There's nothing like light. And when we would go to the Met together, someone said to me, one of the National Gallery said, I would walk through the National Gallery with Fairfield Porter as any man, including me. He was very trenchant, but one of the things he used to say was, there's light, there's light, there's light. It took me a long time, I said, where are atheists? Because he really looked at it. He said, that's scientific light. That's not the light I'm talking about. He fell in love with this was almost taboo. We are. Internet is a long, pristine sentence for the other small scale. There was a big one also in Chicago. And people said, Fairfield is just retardateur. Like Mondrian and those flowers of 1926, retardateur. How can we have this old-fashioned thing? We should be language poets. We should be conceptual artists. We should be of our time, de son époque. And is this of our time? Yes. So in 1972, I said to him, paint my wife, she's very beautiful, we're getting married. He said, well, come up and I'll paint maybe both of you. You learn something from talking to artists. He said, I will leave your mouth open because you're always talking. My wife said, I have to come down and model at 9. I've been a model. I had seen nothing to it. You can see that she's a little angry, but at some point I said to him, red socks? He said, look, you're wearing them. I said, right. I said, did you have to paint them? What is interesting about this double portrait, there are many things that I like about it. One is that he gave it to me, is that I learned a lot by talking to this artist. It was only a little bit till we were best friends. And the years that I spent with him, as it were, in his house and learning from him, were extraordinary. He told me that one of the ways he got this wetness was from an encounter in the Louvre. A man came up to him and said, you're interesting. Fairfield said, why? So the man said, you're painting like the Impressionists as if it's watercolor. That's what their secret was. He said, but you don't have the secret of their medium. His medium was fairly dry at that time, in the 50s. He improved immediately when he used linseed oil to such an extent that he said to me, I'll give you this picture, but it's not dry yet, of another picture. I said, what can you do? How long will it take to dry? He said, some of them never dry. But it's possible that I'll figure out a way. He wrote to me that he found a way of putting butter and wax paper, and he sent it to me. Of another painting, he said, it's a dud, you can take it. But it wasn't a dud. It was a great gift giver. What he loved was light. And so you feel, if I just cut out the white, gray, white, or the field of light and reflection, you would have not a normal bad painter, but someone who was actually as fresh and as interesting as many of the painters of our time. He was open to Jasper Johnson, wrote one of the most beautiful first reviews of him, speaking about the clear, childlike draftsmanship in his work. He was such a good critic that he said of Joseph Cornell, he distributes, his boxes hold the highest and lowest reaches of the human spirit. Interestingly, he only said the highest reaches, but I've added this. The highest and lowest reaches of the human spirit, because it's a little closer to what he loved. And Cornell loved that so much that he sent him a box of mail. I always dreamt of, let's say, of a place where you could describe a house that would become yours by description. In a certain way, it does. I think that criticism is an act of love. His family came up to him because one of them is Elliot Porter, the photographer of nature. A family member came up and said, "Poor Fairfield, you can't paint a likeness." And then she left. Like a very good critic. You say what you said. You depose the work of art. You challenge its very existence. And Fairfield was left alone. I wondered how he would take this. And he said, "I can make a likeness." That's about it. Like a little teenager who knew that he could do something. But he had set himself against a reigning dogma of the time. He was shaking a stigma at dogma, as my Shapiro joke. So I learned a lot from this. He didn't do preparatory drawings for this. He would sometimes show me that he did do preparatory drawings, but I said, "But what's your image of drawing?" Because it seems so radical. And he said, "Making these shapes. You do it in your doodles." He purposely put up a doodle of mine once on a wall. He said, "That's very good. Be unashamed like a child. Be unembarrassed. Don't color in, color." These are very good remarks of a critic. He said to me, "But I can't teach. Teaching is a great sin. What do I know that I can teach?" And he said, "I do know how to stretch a canvas." He is a buff, but I do know the alphabet. "I do know how to stretch a canvas." And then he went on to see that he could indeed be a teacher. But he was a wonderful teacher. I said to him, "Could you teach me foreshortening?" He said, "Sure." I said, "When?" He said, "Tonight." So all day I waited, like a night student, for this thing. And I had a piece of paper, he had a piece of paper, and I said, "What are the laws of foreshortening? What do you want me to do? What should I do?" He said, "Draw what you see." I had a terrible sinking feeling, it's like an appearance of George Bush in your life. But he was actually the opposite, and I said again, "Yes, but what else should I do?" Rather interested in spontaneous problem. He said, "Draw what you see." At that moment I felt utterly tricked, and only learning slowly that, of course, like the bibliography of Marx, or give me a bibliography of structure, he wasn't going to make it easy on me. He was teaching me a very great lesson, which is, rely on yourself. Frank O'Hara said, there are critics who seem just to prefer someone else's poem. So what? He wrote me a letter and said, "Isn't modest criticism?" But O'Hara did this when I was 15. I sent him poems. He said, "I hope you don't mind that I've gotten them published, because I noticed that you had already put them together as a book." I said, "No, I don't mind." He was very generous, and he said, he was always saying, the smallest thing in your head that's real is better than the biggest thing in someone else's head. He would call parts of his poetry personist, personalist. But I think one of the things that makes it pragmatic is this idea that the freshness of poetry is what keeps English as well as keep English up. Kenneth Coe put it this way, his friend, and I think this is a great criticism. He said, of permission, Michaud spoke of surrealism as a grand permission, a grand permission, in the sense of an army leave. So, in this case, realism is a kind of grand permission. You don't have to give up the body. De Kooning said, who also painted women, it is absurd to paint women, but it is absurd not to. Oil was invented for the flesh. And so de Kooning even got in a fight. He said, that man is trying to take my women away from me. Next. All of these are wonderful explosions of color, so that he was looking for light. And of course, you all know the physics of this problem. Like a poet with a very complex theme, for example, of suffering itself. Very hard for a painter to have any business with this late, elated burst of color. It reminds me of Williams, and I do believe that one of the things a critic can do is intersemiotic translation. Baudelaire said the proper response to a painting may be a poem. The proper response, his friend Rudy Burkhardt would set one of my poems to a movie. I thought that was a very good translation. Intersemiotic translation means there's a relay of insight. that we have what Meyer Shapiro called communal seeing. An hypothesis being that you're never innocent with your eye. You do need criticism. I said to Meyer Shapiro when I became a New Yorker art critic, but don't you think this is going to put me in a terrible sense of having to write very quickly? He said, try to comprehend before you evaluate. Of course, in my generation, we would say, if the terrain is not of value itself, how can you comprehend before you value? But at any rate, I want you to see this is a criticism of a great dogma. I said, did Clement Greenberg paint? He said, yes, his own name, Green Hills. And his wife said, you also paint your name fair. This is rotating. He said to me, I'm trying to render the sun. It's very difficult. David Hockney does a lot. So careful, 100 times better than David and others. But he was rather humble that there was this task that was difficult, rendering the sun above the ocean. And one of the things that I love, this is it. One of the things that I love about this, I can hardly tell whether it's moonlight or sunlight, but it's an amazing ambiguity. And also the shapes, which one friend, Ron Patrick said, well, it's Prendergast. And I said, yeah, Prendergast, yes. But these shapes are also, if I cut out that bottom, one of the reasons you even ask what is it, is that if I cut out this section of it, it could be many, many different painters, and some young painters today. I used to say it looks as if it was painted today, and someone said it looks as if it was painted tomorrow. Like Kerguelen's poetry, which was dated Scardanelli, 1942. So here you get a very late and melancholy, not elated Fairfield. Next, this would be 75 when he died in July. And just another example of what he wrests from this scene. Well, we'll go on. Yeah? Okay. He liked to look, he liked to pay attention. He was willing to live with a schizophrenic poet friend for a very long time. He could meet up in some. I'm suggesting that art is gift-giving, and so one of the gifts that a critic can give, this sounds grotesque and sentimental, is the gift of receptivity, a momentary surrender. When I think about criticism, I think of it as being very specific, and as specific as love. I think Auden says, don't say you'll love me forever, say you'll love me next Thursday at 3 o'clock. There's a big difference that you should always know. If you use always, never, psychologists are always saying, I can make the rest of your lives happier in a second. Whenever you hear someone say you always, you never, like two other phrases like this, it's what Jeanette called the pseudo-iterative. On those Sundays, we always did this, we always did this, we always did this. But you didn't always do all of those things. The pseudo-iterative. No one has found you to be always cruel, always shy, always. So, what Fairfield disliked about science was that it was characteristically becoming more and more generalizing. And so he felt that since art was a sensuous dance, as Susan Langer had posited, a sensuous dance of particulars, he couldn't find a world truth and take it out of Shakespeare because it was so woven into things. He was a wonderful poet for that unity. Next. These are definitions. Leonardo said, how do you paint hair? Like water. How do you paint water? Like hair. De Kooning said, hair is impossible. So here are people doing something which is, Jimmy Hewell said, well, they're always going to fail. They'll never be as good as Velázquez. That's why we should be abstract painters. I think that that's heuristic. If you think that you can never write a sonnet again, I said to Rosenkrantz, painting dies, you think so does the sonnet, and then someone comes along, the young Rimbaud, and freshens it up as a form. And then someone else comes around and freshens it up as a form. Yes. Meyer Shapiro said to me, I didn't know, I love the Prince of Peril. I didn't know he was also so urban. He took it for granted that you did care about the subject matter of something. There's even a film about him praising George Segal. You would never think that Meyer would have admired so much, but he gives himself up to George in his particular kind of plaster cast. It's an amazing movie from Michael Blackwood Associates, I think. So here is, for Fairfield, he said, it's my Vermeer. He was very pleased that he could make this image of New York with all its realia. On the other hand, that like a great painter, he has many things happening at one time, so that you already feel that the tonal language of gray and pink is dazzling. He's kept it fairly abstracted, a building, but also the ghost of a building. I once saw next to a lot of bad posters, the Jasper Johns of the Whitney, which was a white target. I said, why is it up here on the 7th floor? They said, well, you don't like it, do you? I said, like it. A word that Jasper Johns hates, like it. Gustav. I said, it's a very great painting. It's worth more than almost all of your paintings. And they said, we call it the ghost of a painting. I said, wow, the ghost of a painting. That's very nice. Very often, all you have to do, I said the other day, is invert everything that a certain critic says, and you may come upon the truth. We know that in the relativism of anthropology. But I do want you to know that I'm dazzled by what Fairfield was up against. Again and again, not selling. He said to me, I will sell after my death, it will help my children. Yes? Lobster pots. Is it simply Monet revisited? I just saw Monet in your institute. No, this is fresh and beautiful. He said, I looked in my island when John Ashbery was there, and I said to John, as it were, I know how beautiful my island is. There are critics who think they are the only people who have found this out. And I think they're ingenious very often. I've just seen about 20 essays on me, and I must say that it was very interesting, except, as Jasper said, sometimes you can quibble with interpretations, but even the facts are wrong. People don't call you up and say, did you leave out Barbara Getz from that anthology? And I could say, no, Ron Padgett threatened to destroy the papers if I did, and he takes 99% and actually went away. But sometimes scholarship is simply a task of work, and if you're doing contemporary work, you may need to find an artist. We'll go a little faster. I took too many. Next slide. Look at that. We were talking about Hans Hofmann. Look at that yellow bursting. William Carlos Williams says in the poem, yellow, 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 the stain of love's on the wall. Or Lorca says, verde, que te quiero verde, green, how much I want you, green. So here's this burst of color. Now, I see it as a heritage that he was not merely a reactionary saying to Greenberg, I will not do what you say to do. He also had a very complex, what I call a maximalism. I would go on this, we're very close to just lay out one sense of like how what I would do, etc. Do you take it down? Oh, okay. I have so many things with me. It would take me 5 hours, 7 hours. So let me just say, Dr. Sid says in a beautiful schema, I could put it that there's always an aggression, a sense of my, what I would call, what do you want? Dr. Sid is a great critic who wrote a beautiful series of essays on poetry as grammar, grammar as poetry. He gave me the addresser. This is the question. And he believed the address C. But these were always part of communication. He said here was what he calls the message, but I'll change it a little more likely to form. And he said there was context, contact, and code. He said these things essentially are there in textile design, I would say, in architecture. Wherever you go, it's very hard to find something that doesn't have an addresser. Of course, you immediately say, which he didn't, that much work of art is collaborative. And I've done a lot of work to know that when a good critic establishes something, for example, Kenneth Coates had a beautiful anthology on collaboration. I have another one, but that's one of the things that critics can do. So much of the work is multiple. But he said all of these axes of the aesthetic can be foregrounded or not. Foregrounded. For example, you might say that when I say, aux armes citoyennes, it would be a mistake. It does seem to be what he calls, it's a tricky word, co-native. It does seem as if that's a bit of an emphasis. You should perhaps take a little bit of pleasure, but there might be a time I say to myself, stand up. Would you stand up, sir? Well, that's a classical critical thought. In other words, I was just saying something, and then, which happens in the performative of language, he stood up. You can wage wars by saying, we're at war with you. You can get married by saying, I do. You have to watch out, because language can do that. So there's usually an addresser, and what happens, he says, it's emotive. You know that's true, because who has read a car manual recently? Have you ever read a car manual? Who's read the newspaper? The weather report? Well, you rarely say, wonder how that weatherman is feeling. I feel the Byronism within him. Jacobson has said Byronism is part of the structure of Byron. But that's making a classical critical faux pas. Giving the flag of Jasper Johnston someone on Flag Day is a classical critical faux pas. Saying that his work makes deep the surface and gives flatness to that which has depth. Clement Huber said, I call it homeless representation. Yes, exactly, and how wonderful. But here we have the context, which he calls referential. When you're reading a car manual, and I had this problem in geology, I went to geology class, but I just like the words. Magma, syncline, anticline. These were amazing words, and I was writing poetry through them. My son said, well, you got a C in geology. All the other things were great. I said, yes, but I wrote about 10 to 20 poems. You know? But that's a classical, I was taking it as if the context was nothing. What was interesting to me was, now he says a message or form. Since he was, and you should just know the code is what he calls the metalingual. The contact is like these hunking to each other. He speaks of that as a phatic. And he says the addressee, and good Marxists know this, the addressee is the conative. If all you care about, for example, is the business career of Hummel and how he was received in concerts, that's rather interesting. But it's as if you are indeed mostly concerned, like great receptual critics, addressing the addressee. You make a lot of mistakes if you only do that. Now what I'm saying is that criticism is like this. We have emotive, well, I'll say a few things. One of the things I'd like to say is that why is poetry so complex for all critics? He sounds like Elder Olson. I'm a great pluralist, but also University of Chicago is famous for neo-Aristotelianism, and this is a little neo-Aristotelian of me. Many of our quarrels are not real quarrels, but one man believes in the psychoanalytic point of view, one man believes in the audience, one man is taken very much by, there's a Van Gogh of a zouave. I say to people, do you know what a zouave is? Rarely met a person who knows what a zouave is. And one day someone said, they were the ferocious soldiers that scared the Albanian soldiers. They invented the first cravat, if that interests you. Well, it is interesting sometimes when you're teaching Van Gogh to know there's a big book and a little book. And the big book is a Bible, open to Isaiah, the flesh pots. And the other book is a book, Pleasure of Life, or Joie de Vivre. The big book and the little book, if you know nothing except what Jacobson said art was, he finally said it was a self-referential, self-focusing, telescoping thing. But I'm saying this, I think makes blue skies less interesting than blues. This is a figure from Kenneth Burke. One is not good equipment for living. Freud says, we think we are going with summer clothing to the Alps, and we are on a polar expedition. Many people can't take poetry because the wonderful thing about this, I say, is that there's a spin of these axes. You never see them alone. Jacobson understands that. He said, I like Ike. I like Ike is a very pretty little poem for clothing, and it wraps the loving subject, he says, in the loving object. However, what I'm saying is that a mature sense of poetry comes if you think also of poetry as the most complex thing we do. Simon Weil said it's more complex than mathematics. One of the reasons art puzzled Marx was, why does it last? A Greek work, it's just we don't treat women like tripods, so you shouldn't like Ulysses. How could it possibly happen that the Odyssey intrigues you? Or even Ulysses by George. Doesn't it die? Marcel Duchamp said it dies. You know? And to some sense, maybe there's a death. But one of the reasons it doesn't die is that it's loaded as the most complex. I used to say, when a computer can translate, it's so loaded. I saw Neruda had a line, I want to beat up the notary. I thought, that's a fairly weak, infantile. I never liked that line very much. Someone said to me, what do you think this is? The notary public, the little mild guy in the drugstore. I said, well, notario, if you look it up, it says notary. He said, no. Does someone know what a notary is in Latin America? Tough guy in town, the gangster, the boss, the mayor. When you're translating it, you have to go very deep to get what a notario, the notary is. You might have to live in Mexico. The only person I ever found out who could translate that adequately was a person plunged into the midst of a great deal of things. So, yes, context does matter. And what is the work of a good critic? Very much like this. A critic can say, ouch, I hate this, it repelled me. A critic can mostly be involved, and we were talking about this otherwise, the criticism can be itself a poem, but Marxist critics like to say how many copies, the whole world is reading Mayakovsky. Pasternak said, yeah, compulsory like potatoes under the reign of Catherine the Great. He loved Mayakovsky, but he didn't like necessarily the reception of him. It's an interesting question to ask. Why are certain poets, painters, or others successful? But I think one of the reasons that art is successful and criticism at its best, and this is what I prefer about my favorite critics, unlike Rosalind Krauss, who says Giacometti is good when he's horizontal, bad when he's vertical, who lays down that law. T.S. Eliot was asked, Mr. Eliot, isn't it true that there are no certain propositions unless we believe in God? He said, I've come to believe that. So I think theologically you might be told in a vision what is beautiful. But otherwise, I think we have this very beautiful schema, and for criticism, one of the things I like, Meyer, Shapiro, Barefoot Porter, and a certain number of others, is that they have tended to be perspectivists. It's not eclecticism in therapy, but you'll notice that Barefoot Porter did go through therapy. One of his decisions was, I knew he was good because he used ordinary language, very little theory. I knew the therapist was going to use ordinariness. And so, I don't want you to get too involved in that, but my feeling is there's never an addresser without an addressee. Even if the addressee slips away, like for Emily Dickinson, or for an imprisoned Jew, you will still either overhear your own work, but sometimes when the addressee slips away, it is in that sense functioning, but at an almost frenzied loneliness. As one of my mother said, memorize many poems, they will be good for you in prison. And indeed, they are. I'll stop with that. Now ask me any questions at hundreds of other pages.
I want to ask you about negative criticism. You've spoken about negative criticism at the same time that you've denounced a number of practices. Can you look up the microphone?
The microphone is down to the floor.
So I just wanted to ask you to consider some of the values of negative criticism.
I think that's very interesting. One of the things I would say is that when a certain person laughed at Ezra Pound says, that saved me 5 years. Ford Madox Ford rolled in laughter. Dr. Williams said, what were you talking about when you talk about these, Ezra Pound said, the backs of certain books shining? He said, why didn't you say it? Pound sometimes says, read this and not this. But when I'm asked what to read, I have to say, I read everything. When I was 16, I went very carefully through the ABC of reading and read every single book that he said to read. But as I grow older, I thought of what he had left out. I read Sappho na Pindar. Pindar can still be read. He was praising everything. He said the Old Testament was good for invective. That's actually a foreshortening remark. The Old Testament is not nearly good for invective. He has the most beautiful love poem ever written at the center of it. So, did he make mistakes? He even confessed that anti-Semitism was a suburban prejudice, but that's not quite enough. He's the best ear. He can be very negative, and I think he was an example of a person, though, where negativity and positivity, it's more Hegelian than that. Because, for example, by the time he became Yeats' secretary, he was adding something. You can say he took away this archaism, had many different things that he didn't like, but essentially it was coming from this very powerful feeling about ordinariness of language. So, I mean, it does seem when you see a Frank Gehry that he's taking an enormous negative criticism of modernism. You might want to call it postmodern. But actually, Frank Gehry is alive to many different things. He can be inspired by Pierrot. It's amazing when I was at his house and he said, remind you of the Romanesque churches? And then you saw it. So, but I do want to say I was in Portugal and I was basically with artists whom I was being positive with in certain ways. And somebody said, who was the head of the school, said, you're very New York, all this yes. You only say yes. But when Partisan Review, I was tickled by this, when the Partisan Review had to have a name for itself, they called themselves No, and then they said, too positive. And it's true that, there is now a magazine called No. But it's rather a positive magazine. It doesn't. But I do think, yes, a good doctor should be able to be receptive. If you go to a psychoanalyst who says, you know what you just told me? And I know that I've only seen you for a few times, but you disgust me. Your love of poetry is idiotic. I had a person who said, poetry, you sort of over-specialize in that. I was 18. He was a little bit specialized in that. When I was winning the award, he said, very bad for you. It seems as if money goes on trees. It distorts you completely. Once I gave him about 5 books, he said, all of a piece, gave him back. So there is a way of the scalpel, there can be a way of cutting out. The surgeon must cut out. But I also think the surgeon is very modern in the sense that he has learned a great deal. It's your brain, not someone else's brain, because even brains are not generic. It seems as if they're extremely fluid. Yes, I think that John Ashbery put it for me too, because he put it in emotional terms. He said, I'm bored in advance by the trouble I would create. Concerning criticism, but what I always thought was our criticism was already in our poems. For example, in the 1960s, the New York School had very little criticism, except people like me writing 100 essays on painters. And people joked with us, well, you like the painters because you can't do it. But there's also the sense that I had that an extremely skeptical position, in which poetry is mostly sensual particularism, was not really available to critics who were going to generalize. Fairfield Porter said, well, you can have criticism through analogy. And it's true that Mario Shapiro said in Merleau-Ponty's wonderful essay, maybe his best essay on Cézanne's doubt, Le Duc de Cézanne, he said, this is the closest anyone gets to Cézanne, except that he doesn't say he doesn't date it, he doesn't historicize it, he jettisoned referentiality as if context as if it didn't matter. It's very useful when I read a poem by my son. He says, oh, I wrote that when I was 4. I've forgotten it. He's embarrassed. How could you read that poem that I wrote when I was 10? I said, it's still very good. I write by myself now, Jeff. And so you want to know sometimes whether something is, even with Keats, when they talk about late Keats. But I do admonish myself, it's one of the positive negatives of this idea of pluralism, that the limit of pluralism is that you don't have the advantages of purity, and that you seem to many to be near. I think Hal Foster, basically my student, who is blind to many things, basically feels that I'm not negative enough. Like Adorno, we should say to ourselves, how can there even be lyric poetry in the age after Auschwitz? But I just received a book of Adorno's dreams, and it came to me almost in a dream that the man who said we couldn't write poetry, any poetry in our age after such darkness, kept a dream diary. I'll say it one more time. The man who said there cannot be poetry after concentration camps kept a dream diary. I thought that was wonderful. You know, it's like Mondrian, who said, we must be this way and that way. And someone said, but master, you've Charmin van Vegan, his friend, who he gave a lot of gifts to, flowers, said, but this isn't what you said was possible, Rodrigo. He said, first the painting, then the theory. But it is true that there's, in Picasso, he says of his own work, it's a horde of destructions. I'm only saying that in many ways that could be a mistake. To see modern art as primarily destructive is like seeing Nietzsche as primarily destructive when it's a very positive, in many ways very joyful, the science of joy. But of course you should all know that the weakness of many of my positions is that it seems as if by loving artists you're not doing what Cuthbert said a good critic could do and others do, which is why does this exist at all? Would you like to take this down? I find it a little simplistic and very minimalist, very retarded. This is the kind of thing was done in 1959 by people. Other things I don't like about it? Well, it's horizontal, but it harkens back to Desubro. I'm not sure that this is not a little bit of an irony that we can expunge. Rilke said, and it's fairly negative, be ironic, dig deeper, still be ironic if it's there, until you can be at the very bottom level of irony. But it's hard, I think, to be a good critic, because I think all of these things are happening at once. So if you find a piece of criticism like Coleridge or others that has lasted a long time, it will perhaps be very close to a poetry itself. You'll have an enormous... Sholem was such a poet that when I read him, well, it used to be said by us, a great scholar is even rarer than a great poet. I think that's true. I rarely would see anything like Mario Shapiro, and I've known a few great poets. But to be a great critic is interesting and difficult. He said to me, no style was outdated. Cubism is not replaced by surrealism. The New York School is not replaced by the language poets. They said to Charles, why did you delete us? He said, well, you were already famous, you didn't need it. And I said, but don't you think it would have been a little more honest to say that we did this, but at other times? I find him to be, because you were talking about his essays, I find that he includes only those people, Allen Ginsberg did this too, who reflect upon an aspect of his theory. And that disheartens me. But
Why? I mean, it seems to
it
me
seems
that
like teammanship, not collaborative. It annoys, I guess, the old anarchist in me who feels that criticism in poetry should cooperate, be collaborative. If you play the violin, they say, "You're too sharp." And the teacher said, "Could I draw your attention to something? Your intonation is not perfect." Misha Elman's intonation was perfect. He looked like a Russian waiter, but his intonation was perfect. Your arm is broken. You must be put in a room. He would turn to my wife and say, "Put him in a room. Let him practice." Negative criticism has led to many violinists giving up violin.
But it's saved a lot of time. That is to say,
For some, good
well,
critics.
if a negative critic helps you to see what the idea is of liking something else. That is, if you like A, then you cannot, with the same reason, like B.
I agree with you, but I want to point out that in the history of art criticism, there have been some enormous anti-iconoclastic moments where the Christians, for example, damaged a tremendous amount of Greek sculpture, where Napoleon looted and stole things and upgraded them. One of the things that we've often learned is what Shapiro called, before the Holocaust, an aesthetic Holocaust, where people say, "I don't like French art." Brahms, they said, "There's a French composer to see you." Can't be. There are none. So there's a tremendous sense in which Ron Silverman, for example, today says, "This is post-avant, this is this." And someone said to me, it's really like a very dangerous form of committing surgery on the body of Mother Russia, is what Pasternak said about Stalin. I don't like this. So I just say, as you have found a danger, why don't we be, if I was able to create a fusion, I would say, the positive critic is probably always suggesting, as Adorno himself suggests, not that it's the end of lyric poetry, but he's suggesting it's the end of a certain kind of lyric poetry. If poetry doesn't take into account that it is after, it probably, so he says of a certain Goethe poem, where a world of war it cuts out. The positive critic alone has a lot of negativity. There's a lot of no inside of yes. When you take a wife, you're also saying no, you're renouncing, they say, every other. They hope they do.
Yes, but then, I mean, critical reflection allows you to say why you're reflecting which others.
A patient analyst must learn to like his patients. He will be, in many ways, a shrink, and he will devastate you by disillusioning you. But one of the things that the good analyst must have is, I think Stokes says this and others, he has to have a tremendous amount of receptivity. You're not turned away by any analyst. It would be a great teacher's mistake to say, as my teacher did, "Poor David, at least he can play the violin." And she held aloft the work on. So it's true that I am doing, it's almost a cliche to say that certain negative criticism can be ferocious, cruel, foreshortening, Procrustean. I'm aware that for some people, particularly as they're growing older, they do need some negative criticism, but usually it should be tactful. In other words, if someone says, "That reminds me of my grandmother's dress," I can say, "Yes. What else does it remind you of?" I've therefore taught them pretty quickly that that's a tactless kind of remark. It doesn't matter to me that this reminds me of their. But it is true that in my own criticism, I'm often reminded of this, reminded of that. So it's very difficult to decide who are the critics and what can they look. Certainly, a lot of my time was spent in learning from people who in their studios were filled with negations. But the fact that they went on, I'm also filled with the tragedy. Gustin changes his style and Morty Feldman stopped talking to him. When he went to his funeral, Musa had put out a lot of paintings. He said, "Oh, now I get it." So very often I think we talk about the sins of rhyme. There's a sin of inattention. When Henry James says, "Be like one upon whom nothing is lost." Usually at this level, I'm not as good as one would hope to be. Bob Holman said, "I like all poetry, Jacob." I said, "Well, I like great poetry." He said, "Yeah, you like great poetry. I like all poetry." I said, "All poetry? Even those?" As a teacher, though, in a room, haven't you noticed, we do give negative critiques, but we're very careful to see, like a Buddhist, whether the person is ready for it. There's freedom mongering. When Allen Ginsberg saw me for the first time and said, "Are you a virgin?" that was a very difficult question. Of course I was, but I felt that the aggression of certain negative critics was what I was trying to disenchant people from, because it does seem to me that one of the reasons we're even in the Iraq War is by inattention. We don't learn their language, anyone's. We're not patient enough to learn what we're destroying. We destroy before we comprehend before we evaluate before we comprehend. So those are the dangers. I mean, if you want to know, there's a lot of the political in what I'm saying, which is that some of the cruelty of our culture seems to become about by a sympathy for one's own perspective, rather than what William James said, that Jack and Jill are actually interesting. So one of the things that we learned in the 50s and 60s was that camp and the worst poems were very interesting. Here's a bad poem. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes, into the grave the old queen dashes. It may be one of the 100 bad poems, but it's also wonderful. There's a taste for it that I have, that everybody has, a certain kind of bad poem. My son used to say to me, what's the worst poem ever written? Yeah, that's hard. What's the most disgustingly horrible? I said, well, there is one, cherry blossoms, more and more now. Birds have 2 legs, horses have 4. He said, oh, that's the worst. That's the worst. I said, of course, if you know more, cherry blossoms are a symbol of transiency, and it's actually moving so cherry blossoms more and more now. And then to have this, how could he possibly understand that little poem? Haikus were regarded as not art. Meyer Shapiro always started his classes, so this is the beginning of the class. You'd see a lot of other things. Meyer Shapiro started by saying, the best eye of the 19th century, say Ruskin, said of Asia, India, China, art which has been denied to the peoples of Asia. There's a tremendous sense, I think, in my life of how much I've lost by not having what Meyer Shapiro did, for example, for Delmore Schwartz, who says, I would as lief you read me as any man. When I used to publish a book, I said to Ken, why are we so in love with books? It's amazing. You build a book. And he said, yes, and then we can throw it at the world's head. Or we can send it to anyone we want in the universe. You can send it to Catherine Deneuve. You can send it to George Bush. I do think that a tremendous amount of negative criticism is probably very positive. The person is really saying, I enjoy Adorno. Your work lacks his da-da-da-da-da-da. And that's when I'm not sure that we would do it if you have a child. It's very hard to say, I prefer someone else's child. But it is a dangerous theme that I'm evoking, because Meyer Shapiro said what the Met should do is have open exhibits where you and I could be in. This just was devastating. Does he have his feet on the ground? We will choose. You know? He said to Bryce Martin, these Roman frescoes were great. He said, pretty good. I said, no, wonderful. There's this. He said, I was being too enthusiastic. But I agree with you. It's very bad to be merely positive, and probably bad to be merely negative. We don't see them, as I believe in a mixed poetry. I think it's a mixed critic. Riegel says, though, the decadence of Rome didn't really exist. We misjudged it. Riegel says, for every single moment, there's enough of a principle to follow. And that's the relativity that influenced my teacher, Meyer Shapiro, Riegel, who's without a sense of triumph. Even the late Spätromanische coin industry is interested for itself. So a child brings in the worst paper we've ever seen. But it shows us their level. If I play clarinet, it's going to take me a long time. If you just laugh at me and say, ha, you are really bad.
This is quite a related question about what you've called the loss that you've kind of acknowledged, the loss of purity. And I want to slightly just reframe it and ask about the possibility of belief. One of the facts, or one of the logical structure of belief is its exclusivity, its commitment, which is a commitment to one thing and not another. And here I'm not necessarily talking about a critical position so much as I am an artistic one. One isn't always invested in the preference for something over something else, but rather in a set of fundamental orientations toward the world that don't admit of their opposites. And to say, well, yes, but call everything up, or to think of things as entirely bound to perspectives, is to shrink from, it seems, the fact that sometimes what we're dealing with is not a perspective, but a belief That doesn't get rid of perspective. And
My
it's correlative.
sense from Proust is that, sadly enough, with great disenchantment, and Proust is my god, they divide the world between them. Kafka for the starless chaos inside, and Proust for the starless chaos outside. And I think that what Proust does say to that situation is that, and you know it, they hated it in high school because people were already writing Proustian sentences. He insists that we see through glasses, and that it's a kaleidoscopic thing out there. My sense, not just because of drugs and other situations, my sense is that we do wear glasses. I remember the first time I ever put it on, which was on a summer's evening when I was 10. I think that it's very difficult to come upon something, and the pragmatist world is talking come upon, as you were suggesting, like a denunciation. Really, I find it very interesting. I once said to Anne Porter, do you believe in heaven? She said, as I said when I was a child, we were built for heaven, like a boat. And I said to her, to her husband, anyway, let me just say that, yes, Eliot said some of the greatest belief, though, is expressed by unbelief in our age. The dark absence of God has been, as a matter of fact, the central theme of Jews who had to contend with what's been called the caesura, in which it seemed as if the divine had withdrawn completely. And to me, I mean, just to show you the darkness of what I'm saying, the darkness is that, like the open exhibit, that it might be filled with a lot of things that don't have what you want, but it will be filled with a democratic, flexible, and free Shelley-esque relay in Deleuze's sense. And so we're just saying, how sweet is that? Well, Deleuze says you can't go in the street and just shout, vivo multiplicity. And it may seem as if I do that. Against certain dictators, we do seem to feel that we want to say, and anthropologists say, too much purity, too much chaos and danger. Great little groups in anthropology. And so it's possibly wrong to love so much, so deeply. D.H. Lawrence says, how can you? He criticizes Whitman, remember, for saying, I love everyone, I love the Eskimo, I love this. He said, not so fast, Walt. It's hard to love a specific. But hating a specific in that sense, Catella says, you think your girlfriend doesn't care about me, but she's constantly ranting about me. Get it? Catella says, Odi et Amo, we're still talking about this dialectic. Danto says of a Matisse, if anyone says that's beautiful, they're lying. It's impossible. Blue Nude in Baltimore. And someone and I said, we're saying that the painting is very beautiful. It's not true that Matisse is impossible to reveal beauty. It's a different kind of beauty. And I said to someone, one of my friends said, Africa doesn't have aesthetics. They don't have the word for beauty. I put up Robert Barris Thompson. I said, what do you think about the fact that there are 70 languages that don't have a word for beauty? And he said, don't they know about synonyms? They don't have a word. I said to a Native American, what do you call a work that you like? And she said, we say it's alive. So I'm just saying, your question to me is a kind of, but there is an eternal question, as one sees in Wallace Stevens, of whether you get towards inside or outside belief. I think the pathos, the feeling tone of suffering, and I hope it's within my work, but it's certainly within the great work of Stevens and Ashbery. When Ashbery wrote The Skaters, a lot of people thought Allen Ginsberg said to me, it's sort of like Alexander Pope. Anyway, Kenneth Coates saw it in a different way and said, isn't it the loneliest poem ever written? Almost pathologically lonely. Different kind of sense of how to read things. But I know that, yes, I think that both are typically good. The task of a critic may be in part, though I think, to be positive enough to read the work, to really look at the work. One of the things Leo Steinberg says about looking at Rothko is nobody looks at it for more than 3 seconds. You just look and they pass on. So without loitering, as a good critic does, really seeing it in all its aspects. I tell people, like, marriage is not a love affair, or marriage is not done by Polaroids. So I'm really talking about the scale of belief and the scale of a work. And there are people who thought Dante had some good parts. He's encourages, but it's the theme of many of the great Italian critics. What part of Dante will you save? I'm trying to save much poetry that has been beaten down. And a lot of my life, I thought some of the best parts of it were actually praising things that have not been praised. Rilke says praise, but of course there's lament. You know, we can suggest that there are critics who write in melancholy about, you know, I think when Meyer found that Freud made a mistake in what bird it was, and then wrote 100 pages based on an error. You know, was this a crow? Was this a, you know, if I wrote sparrow, you said, reminds me of a raven again and again. Might not. Anyway, there's no perhaps satisfactory ending. I said to Jeremy Gordon, people are reading, that's a little, people pay attention to other things in a certain moment. We're not paying attention as much, for example, to the Ptolemaic universe as we used to. And so it's like we're not even disproving it anymore, we simply are now paying attention to another picture. Poetry, it seems to me, is amazing because there are these tyrannical critics who take poetry, which is an act of love, I feel, anyway, and who then legislate it out of business. You don't feel this cruelty of certain critics.
No, I know. There are critics whose interest is not in the poetry, but we're nonetheless writing about poetry.
You're writing about poetry, but none of it. If I give you honey, it's a very difficult thing, and you say, I'm very interested in why Buster Keaton failed. But the way you'd understand that Buster Keaton failed would be to know the Buster Keaton movies, to know who he was, to know the form of the general, to discuss what a movie is, when it happened. He was lambasted because his black humor didn't work until about 1968 when college kids. But there's so much to say about it. But if you only knew one part of this, then I would say no to the simplicity of it. It's not equipment for living is what art is. So if I said to you, I will only live on coffee for the rest of my life, no food, you'd say, you're going to have a problem. And some critics to me, just as they say a poem lacks this, that, and the other, but they too have not always done their whole work. And I want to say, the last thing I'm going to say is, but it's very hard to do. If every reporter walked with me and said, just remember this, when you realize it's very hard to make a good painting. And so it's very hard to be a good critic or a good painter. And the reason, I think, is because of this extraordinary complexity of the poetic object, of the artistic object. Okay, thanks.